book of Proverbs, in the Old Testament, chapter 14. Proverbs 14. In 2006, I was here for a revival meeting, and that revival meeting began with a banquet or dinner, whatever you want to call it, on a Saturday evening. And Brother Todd had asked me specifically to share what I'm going to share with you tonight at that time, and he asked me to do it again tonight. And so I'm thankful to have the opportunity to do that. If you've heard this before, just pray for me. If you haven't, just listen, okay? Proverbs chapter 14, look down, if you will, at verse 12. I like to hear those pages rustling. I'll give you time to get there, okay? When you find Proverbs 14:12, say amen. Okay, here we go. There's a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. I don't know about you, that's an interesting verse to me. It tells us there that there are those individuals in our world that have a philosophy, they have a theology, they have a concept of God that they think is accurate. There's a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof is the way of death. In other words, it is possible to be deceived to the point to think that you've got all the right answers, that you've got everything all lined up, that everything is just fine between you and God, and yet be completely, totally deceived. That's an alarming thought to me, because I look around our world and I look in the Word of God and I see what people are doing, and there's an obvious chasm between the two different things. And here the writer of Proverbs tells us that there are a multitude of individuals around us who think they've got it right, but they're deceived. There's a way that seems right, but the end thereof the ways of death. And then he goes on in that next verse to give us kind of a litmus test of how to know whether that deception has taken root in a person's heart or not. And he says, even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. He's describing there a person in verse 13 who's all sunshine and smiles on the outside, but inwardly they're dying ever so slowly, just a little bit every day. They're the life of the party. They're always telling jokes and backslapping and glad-handing and all of that kind of stuff. But when they go home and put their head on the pillow at night, they're not fooling themselves or God. And they know down deep in their heart that everything they think is just so is not accurate. I was sharing at Hannibal LaGrange College one time in their chapel service and was using those two verses for my text. And afterward, the professor from the English department came over to me. How many of you did real good in English in school or college? How many of you slept through English like I did? Amen. And anyway, the professor from the English department came over to me afterward and he said, "Sir, did you know those two verses, the grammatical construction is known as a paradigm shift?" I said, "A what?" He said, "A paradigm shift." I said, "I don't even know what a paradigm is, let alone how to shift it." And he said, No. He said, and then he got that professorial tone. You all know what I'm talking about. And I said, "I don't know what that is." And he said, "Well, a paradigm shift is when you make a decision based on the information you had to make the decision on, only to find out after you made the decision that the information you had to base the decision on was wrong or inconclusive or incomplete, and therefore the decision you made could in no way have been accurate." I said, slow that way down and put that in layman's terms so somebody as simple as I am can understand it. And he said, a paradigm shift is when you make a decision based on the information you had available to you at the time you made that decision, only to find out after you made the decision that the information you had to base that decision on was either false or incomplete or inconclusive, and therefore there's no way that you could have made an accurate decision. Paradigm shift. And I thought, well, isn't that something? There's a way that seems right, but the end thereof, the ways of death. There are a lot of people in this world who have made their decision about God based on information they had available to them at the time, only to find out after they made their decision that the information they had wasn't right. And therefore, their decision about God could never have been accurate. I really want you to get a hold of that tonight. I found the definitive illustration of a paradigm shift, and of all places, I was sitting in my doctor's office one day waiting for my appointment, and my doctor is one of those guys that he's too cheap to buy new magazines and asks his patients to bring in their magazines when they get done and leave them laying around the waiting room. Are you with me? And there was stuff in there like Ladies' Home Journal and Knitting Needles Aflame or something. I don't know what it was, and quilts and all that kind of stuff. And the only thing laying on that table of magazines that even halfway captured my attention was a magazine called Camping USA. How many of you have ever seen that publication? Several of you. And I don't own a camper, and I'm not too much into swatting mosquitoes and sweating in the summertime, so I don't usually do that, but that was the only thing there to read, so I picked it up and kind of thumbed through it, and the only thing that caught my attention, there's a section in that magazine called Letters to the Editor. And so I began to read through some of those just to see what that was all about. And as I began to read through there, I got so tickled at one letter that was in there that I started laughing so hard. The receptionist behind the counter leaned over and looked out there, and she said, "What in the world is wrong with you?" And I said, "Have you read this magazine?" And she said, "What is it?" And I said, "Camping USA." And some other guy sitting across the waiting room said, "You're laughing at an article in Camping USA?" And so I thought, I'll just give it to the whole waiting room. I said, "Listen to this." And so I just read it to them. It's been around for a while, and if you've heard it before, that's fine. Now, I hope you don't think me too crude for reading this in church, but the Bible says a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, and some of you look like you could use a trip to Dr. Jesus tonight, okay? So it's okay to go ahead and laugh. Just try to keep a little bit of control about yourself, okay? This came from a camp in Sherman, Oregon, and letter went something like this. My friend is a rather old-fashioned lady, quite elegant and delicate, especially in her language and speech. She and her husband were planning a week-long camping trip, and so she wrote to a campground to make reservations. She wanted to be sure that the campground was fully equipped, but didn't quite know how to ask about the toilet facilities. She didn't want to write the word toilet in her letter, so after much deliberation, she wrote the old-fashioned term, bathroom commode. But when she wrote it down and reread her letter, she thought it to be a bit too forward, and so she rewrote the letter again and referred to the toilet simply as the BC, short for bathroom commode. Her letter went something like this. Dear sirs, does your campground have its own BC? Well, the campground owner wasn't nearly as old-fashioned as my friend, and when he got the letter, he couldn't figure out what in the world she was talking about. This BC business really stumped him. After worrying about it for a while, he checked with some of the other campers, and no one could figure out what she was talking about. So after much thought, the owner decided that what she must be inquiring about was the location of the local Baptist church. BC. So he sat down and wrote the following reply. Now, keep in mind, before I read his reply to her, a paradigm shift is when you make a decision based on the information you've got, only to find out after you make that decision, you had some bad information to make that decision on. There is no way this campground owner could have sent her a proper response to her letter. He didn't have near enough information, did he? Listen to what he wrote her. Dear Madam, I regret very much the delay in answering your letter, but I now take great pleasure in informing you that the BC is located just a short 6 miles north of the campground. Now, I'll admit this is quite a distance away if you're in the habit of going regularly. Some of you younger folks, us old guys, we understand this thing, but the last time my wife and I went was 6 months ago, and it was so crowded we had to stand the entire time. It's capable of seating approximately 250 people at once. However, they've planned a supper to raise funds for more seats in the BC, and it's to be held in their basement fellowship hall. Oh, I'd have loved to have been there when she read this line. I would like to say that it pains me that I'm not able to go more regularly, but it's not for a lack of desire on my behalf. As we grow older, it seems to be more of an effort, and especially in colder weather. Can't you just picture her dentures falling out and hitting the floor about then? Oh. But no doubt you'll be pleased to know that a great number of folks from our campground go and take lunches and just make a day of it. They usually plan to arrive early so they can be sure and get a good seat. If you decide to come to our campground, perhaps my wife and I could go with you the first time and introduce you to some of the other folks. Remember, this is a very friendly community. Thank you for considering our campground for your vacation. Oh. But I really want to get you to get a hold of that paradigm shift tonight, because I spent the first 26 years of my life stuck in a paradigm shift. There's a way that seems right. I really thought I had the answers, but I found out the hard way. The end thereof are the ways of death. You see, I began to gather my information to base my decision about God on when I was 8 years old. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I had never been to vacation Bible school. I had never had a Sunday school education. I didn't know what the Bible was about. I had no idea of the difference between Genesis or Revelation. I didn't know anything about church. I didn't know anything about it whatsoever till I was 8 years old. One Saturday night, my mother, just out of the clear blue, made the announcement to my two older sisters and I, y'all get your baths early tonight because we're going to go to church in the morning. And as an 8-year-old boy, I got excited and I said, we're all going to church tomorrow? She said, yeah. And I said, man, I can't wait to see this. You see, as an 8-year-old boy, I had already begun that paradigm shift. I had seen church buildings, and almost every church building that I saw as a little boy either had a cross up on the steeple or a cross in the stained glass windows on the church or out on the sign in front. But on almost every church I saw, there was a cross there somewhere. And I'd seen ladies wear necklaces with crosses on them and had earrings with crosses dangling from them. And so in my 8-year-old mind, I thought those church buildings must certainly be where they manufacture that jewelry and where all those women get those necklaces and earrings from. And so I wanted to go and see how they made that jewelry. Boy, was I in for a surprise. There wasn't anything near that exciting going on in that building when we showed up. I mean, we got there the next morning and walked in, and of course we didn't get there early. We got there on time, and we found out if you want one of the good seats, you know, the ones all the way in the back, you got to get there a little bit early. And so when we got there, the only thing left open was about 2 or 3 pews all the way down in the front. It was a small town country church, and it was one of those, I call it a shotgun building, kind of narrow and long, and one center aisle down the middle. And so here we go. We're the strangers, you know, we've never been to church, and we come down that center aisle and marched into about I can't remember now for sure, but it was about the 2nd or 3rd pew. And we had no sooner sat down than an usher came walking over to my dad and tapped him on the shoulder, and he said, sir, I'm sorry, but you can't sit there. And now, you had to know my daddy. He had a real short fuse. It burnt fast, and it didn't take much to get it lit. Are you with me? And my dad looked at that usher, and he said, well, I didn't see anybody's stuff sitting here, and there's no reserve sign on it. And the usher said, well, you just need to find somewhere else to sit. And my dad said, well, if you're going to reserve seats, you ought to put a sign on them or something. And with that usher took about a half step backward, and he pointed at the end of that pew, and he said, you see that brass tag on the end of that pew? That says the Smith family bought and paid for that pew, and even if they don't come to church this morning, then nobody will sit there. It's their pew. Now get up and find somewhere else to sit. And so my dad stood up and moved him, pushed him out of the way and moved out in the aisle, clicked his fingers and motioned at our family like that, and we all got up, walked down that center aisle with every eye in that building looking at us. And we walked right out the back door and got in the car. And I remember wondering later in life, wonder what difference it would have made in my life and in my family if somebody would have come up and offered to shake our hand and said, man, I'm so glad you're here tonight. How'd you all happen to hear about our church? Are you a guest with somebody? Are you just visiting for the first time? Or, man, sit anywhere you want to. We're glad you're here. Just relax and enjoy the service. We're so thankful you're here. Wonder what difference it would have made. I don't, to this day, really understand or know what all the details were that my mom and dad decided we were going to go to church that day. But I found out later that they were having some marital problems and weren't getting along, and I think they went to look for some answers to try to glue things back together. And they didn't find any. And so about a short time after that, my dad, who had owned his own business at that time, he got in his car to go to work one morning. He just kept going. We didn't know what happened to him, where he went to, whether he was dead or alive, until 4 years later he turned up out in California. And so because of that, we lost the business my dad owned. We lost the house we were living in. And we wound up moving in with an aunt of mine over in Osawatomie, Kansas. And I was about 10 years old at that time, and I thought, there's got to be more to life than this. And I remember just being angry and kind of upset, especially when I found out my dad was still alive and he didn't even have the decency to tell us where he was or what was going on. And I started at a very young age becoming one of the most angry, rebellious young men you've ever met in your life. And I remember that little town we lived in. I was uptown one day and walking down Main Street, and they had a municipal auditorium building in that town, City Hall or whatever you want to call it. And it was one of those buildings that had a basketball gymnasium in it, kind of like this, where they'd crank the basketball goals down and had pull-out bleachers in there. And I walked by there one Saturday morning, there's a bunch of guys in there playing basketball. And I was always tall enough to play basketball, never coordinated enough. I can't even walk and chew gum at the same time, let alone run and dribble a ball. But anyway, I went in there and was just watching those guys play basketball. And hadn't been in there very long, and a fella came over and he said, would you like to play with us? And I said, no, I didn't want to interfere. I just came in to kind of watch. And he said, well, we're just practicing today, nothing serious about it. You'd be glad to join us and join in, have a good time. I said, well, I guess that'd be okay. That was the first time in I couldn't remember how long that anybody had paid positive attention to me and showed interest in me. And I said, well, sure, I'd like to do that. So we played basketball for a while. When we got done, this guy came back over to me and he said, how'd you like to be on our team on a regular basis? And I said, I'm not very good at this. And I said, I'm glad. He kind of stammered and stumbled around there, and he said, no, really, he said, I'd like to have you be on our team and just be a regular part of it. He said, we play games every Saturday. He said, we were just practicing today, didn't have a game, but next week we're going over to Garnett, Kansas, and we're going to play a game over there, and we'd love to have you come, and then the next week we're going to be here and just this and that. And he made it sound so much fun. I said, well, I guess that'd be all right. And he said, well, there's one catch now. He said, these are church leagues, and in order to play in the game on Saturday, you have to come to 2 worship services a week or no basketball on Saturday. I said, you have to come to 2 what? And he said, worship services. I said, what's that? He said, son, have you never been to church? I said, well, I went once, but it didn't turn out too good, and we just, no, I've never been very often. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, you show up at my church, it's right down here, and he told me where it was. He said, you get down there about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'll introduce you to your Sunday school teacher, and you can sit in Sunday school class and then come to morning worship. I said, Sunday school? You got to do homework? He said, you sure enough haven't been to church, have you? I said, no, sir. And he said, well, you just be there at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and I'll help you get situated. So I began to add a little bit more to my information to base my decision about God on, and was a part of that basketball team and had fun with that. And we went to a different town every week, and I started going to Sunday school and church and learning a lot about that. But then some of my friends wanted to know how come I was not around too much on Saturdays anymore. And I told them, I said, well, I didn't want to tell them I was going to church, and just kind of tried to put them off. And I had one friend that just so persistent, he just wouldn't shut up and kept asking and asking. I said, well, I'm playing on a basketball team, and we got games out of town every Saturday. He said, you're playing on a basketball team? I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm a better player than you are. I want to be on that team. I said, no, trust me, you don't want to be on this team. He said, why not? And I said, well, I thought, there ain't no way out of it. I might as well just tell him. I said, it's a church team, and in order to play in the game on Saturday, you got to come to church twice a week, or you don't play in the game on Saturday. He said, you been going to church? I said, yeah. He said, how long you been going? I said, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 weeks now, something like that. He said, well, it ain't hurt you none. You're still cussing and all that other stuff. Said, it ain't going to bother me none. I'll go with you. I'll be on the team. Long story short, before it was over with, that preacher had every hoodlum and street kid in that town on that basketball team. And you talk about causing a preacher holy misery. I mean, we put that guy through so much stuff. We were smoking in the bathrooms between Sunday school and church. And, man, I mean, the deacons in that church, they were fit to be tied, and just, it wasn't good. When I got saved, I called that pastor up and I apologized to him for all the things we did. I really did. But anyway, the straw that broke the camel's back, they had just renovated their auditorium in that church, and man, I mean, they repainted everything and reupholstered the pews and put in chandeliers and just, I mean, all kind of new carpet on the floor. I mean, they really classed it up, and they were having what they called Dedication Sunday. They're going to dedicate that new auditorium to Jesus. And so right in the middle of that auditorium, about halfway back in the auditorium, there sat all those kids on the basketball team. And most of them didn't have any mommies and daddies in church, and so we just sitting there on our own. And I'll never forget, there were two brothers. One of them was a big, tall, skinny guy, and the other one was kind of short and fat. And you couldn't tell whether he was walking or rolling most of the time. You know what I mean? And anyway, I don't remember what their names were, but their nicknames. We all went by nicknames when we were kids. Y'all still do that as young folks? But anyway, I knew them as Duck and Slob. I don't know how they got those nicknames or why, but that was it. And anyway, the little one was picking on the older brother and just talking and just being disruptive and all of that. And the older brother looked at him and he said, boy, if you don't shut up, I'm going to stick you right here in church. Quit bugging me. And the little one tauntingly and mockingly looked over and said to his brother, oh, big man with a knife. Go ahead and do it. I don't think you got the guts. He reached in his pocket, pulled out one of those old Barlow pocket knives. Any of y'all remember those? They were a folding knife that had a blade on it, maybe 2.5 inches long, something like that. He unfolded that knife and held it in his hand. He said, you say one more word and you're going to get it. And his little brother looked up at him and he said, one more word. Go ahead and do it. I don't think you got the guts. And with that, he drew his arm back and stabbed his brother in the leg, buried that knife clear to the handle. That kid jumped up in the middle of that church service right on Dedication Sunday, screaming cuss words at the top of his lungs, blood squirting all over those brand new pews and all over that brand new carpet. Finally made his way out into the aisle, leaving a trail of blood all the way and screaming cuss words and hollering and screaming as he went out that back door. And then I got some more information to base my decision about God on. After church that day, there was a group of men who were some type of leadership in that church that pulled the pastor off into a corner and said, that's it, preacher. You get rid of them stinking street kids on that basketball team, and this is the end of it, or you can find you another church to pastor. We don't want them here anymore. They've done nothing but disrupt and disturb. They've done all kinds of stuff. They've done this, they've done that. and if you don't get rid of them today, we don't ever want them back in this building again. If you don't get rid of them today, we will back a U-Haul up to your parsonage tomorrow and unload your furniture into it, and you will see the last of this town. That's it. We've had it. And I thought, you know what? These folks talk about a God of love. They talk about forgiveness. They talk about loving people who are unlovely. But I don't see much of that put into action. I know we wasn't doing what we should have been doing, and I know that was wrong. But why are they taking it out on him? He's just trying to help us. And so my first education and experience with church was, as long as you sit where you're supposed to sit and do what they tell you to do, you're fine and you're welcome. But the minute you sit someplace you shouldn't, then you're in trouble. And then my second experience was, as long as you mind all the rules and don't upset anybody and you don't never make any mistakes and you live a perfect life and you don't mess up, then you're welcome. But the first time you do something out of line, then that's it, you're out. And I remember standing there hearing them chew that preacher out that day, and I remember thinking, I think I've had about all this I need. I'm not playing basketball anymore anyway. So I quit going. A couple years after that, my dad and my mother miraculously got back together again, and he came back home, but when he did, he and I didn't get along well at all. I had a chip on my shoulder the size of the world because I had the attitude, well, if he really loved us, he could have at least told us where he was going and that he was alive. So if he doesn't care about me, I'm not going to care about him. I have no respect for him. I don't care about him. And so if he moves back home, and he and I just did not get along at all. And so that went on for a few years. And when I was 17 years old, I left home and moved into an apartment building in northeast Kansas City and was trying to get through high school and graduate and trying to work a part-time job, and it just was a tough time. But I remember all my friends at school would look at me and say, man, you're living in an apartment building by yourself? And I say, yeah. Man, you must have the world by the tail. You don't have to, pay attention to mom and dad or what time you come in. You can stay out as late as you want. You can do this. You can do that. And I said, yeah, that's right. I'm in control. I'm something. Even in laughter, the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. Oh, to all my friends, I was telling them, yeah, I'm having a good time. Yeah, I got my own place to live. Yeah, this is going, that's going. But inside, I was the most angry, disillusioned, out of control teenager you have ever met in your life. The neighborhood I was living in was a very run-down, depressed area, and probably more drug problems in that neighborhood than any place in the greater Kansas City area at that time. And wasn't anything for people to be shot or mugged or robbed or just not good. And I remember the apartment I lived in was an old house back in the Pendergast days in Kansas City, and the Depression and all that. A lot of those old mansions that were along some of those boulevards were turned into apartment buildings, and that's what I was living in, was an old house that had all of the rooms turned into apartments. And of course that was back in the 60s, and the hippies and the flower days and flower children, all that stuff. And every Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, every weekend, everybody just opened their doors in their apartments, and you just kind of drift from one apartment to the other to see who had what kind of drugs or what to drink, and just one big long weekend party. And I remember one of those weekends taking place, and I remember waking up on a Sunday morning with a head splitting, and my head felt like it was the size of a basketball. And I looked around that room and saw a young lady laying there in her own vomit, and another guy passed out on the floor in front of the couch. And just as I looked around that room, I thought, there has got to be more to life than this. If my friends think this is fun, if they think this is what it means to have a good time, I'm not seeing it. There's got to be more to life than this. And I remember sitting there with a throbbing head thinking, maybe there's more to this God stuff than I've seen in the past. Maybe there's some answers in that. And so I staggered out to my car and drove down the street to the first church I came to. I didn't know Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian. I didn't know what any of those things were. All I knew was church. And so the first church I came to, I just parked my car and I walked in, and I will admit, I didn't look right. I didn't smell right. I didn't act right. There wasn't anything right about me. And I walked into that church, and I got there early enough I could sit toward the back there, and nobody came up and said anything to my face. But they said it loud enough behind my back to make sure that I could hear it. And it was things like, "Who let that stinking hippie in here? I can smell that kid clear over here. He smells like a walking brewery." Somebody else said, "I know Jesus had long hair, but that ain't no reason for that kid to look like that. I'd like to give him a haircut." And just those comments just kind of went on, and I thought, they're all phonies. There's nothing to this. They talk about helping people and loving people and God of forgiveness and that, but that's not what I'm hearing. So I had some more information to base my decision about God on. Christians are controlling, manipulative. All they want your money. They don't care anything about you. If you don't look like they look, if you don't dress like they dress, if you don't act like they act, you're not welcome, and they don't want anything to do with you. So I got up and I walked back to the door. And just as I went to put my hand on the door to walk out, I just kind of hesitated there for a minute, and I thought, I'm going to make myself a promise right here. I am never going to waste my time going back to another stinking church as long as I live. They're all phonies. They're all hypocrites. Who needs it? And I walked out the door. And for a number of years, I wouldn't go to a wedding. I wouldn't go to any kind of ceremony if it was in a church. I wouldn't go into a church for any reason. There's a way that seems right to a man. I made the horrible mistake that so many millions of people make of making a decision about God based on what I had seen out of people who claimed to be God's people. I had made my decision about God by what I saw that went on in church rather than reading the Bible and finding out the information for myself. Have you ever had somebody tell you something that, you're in a conversation, they say, well, the Bible says cleanliness is next to godliness. No, it doesn't. Have you ever had somebody quote or supposedly quote something to you and say that it's in the Bible only to find out later? The principle may be there, but that's not what it says. And so often people hear someone say something and accept it as fact and never check it out and just pass it along, and all kinds of misunderstandings and misinformation has propagated a lot of people to be in that very same shape that I was in. There's a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. I found out later there's a whole bunch of folks who've been deceived. They believe a whole bunch of stuff that's not in the Bible. Things like, you got to get baptized or you can't go to heaven. Things like, if you're not a member of our church, you can't get into heaven. Things like, if you don't take communion and confess your sins in our church, you can't go to heaven. If you're not a part of our group, you're not going to be welcome in the kingdom of God. You can't find any of that stuff in the Bible. It's just not there. And so I remember after that experience, living in that apartment and going to church and walking out of there, my sole motivation in life, I was going to prove to my dad that I could achieve more than he ever did in his life, that I could do more than he ever accomplished, that I could make it on my own without his help. I was bound and determined to prove to him I didn't need him, I didn't want him, and I could make it on my own. As a 17-year-old boy, I worked hard at that part-time job. I applied myself to get through high school, finally graduated, and At the time, I didn't realize what a tremendous gift it was or even who it was from, but God has blessed me with a tremendous memory. And I had a part-time job working in an automobile dealership, sweeping floors and cleaning up and those kind of things. And later, I got an opportunity. They started letting me do a little bit of work on cars and then a little bit more, and I learned more about auto mechanics, and they sent me to a factory training school. And I'd walked into one of those classrooms out there that day, and the particular class that day was on automobile electrical systems. And back in that day and time, on a Thunderbird automobile, there was 265 miles of wire in one car. I mean, they had wires running here and there and everywhere. And I walked into that classroom that day, and I just kind of flipped through that wiring chart. And after I got done with it, one of the instructors there made the joke, said, "Well, you got that memorized now?" And I closed the book and handed it back to him. I said, "Yep." And I think he was waiting for me to laugh or make a joke out of it. And he said, "You really think you got that memorized?" And I said, "Ask me a question." I could tell him which wire color went to which circuit and which this and which that, and memorized the entire thing in about 10 minutes' time. Back in those days, an automatic transmission had 115 different moving parts and springs in a valve body, and all kinds of different flow charts and hydraulic passages and all that kind of stuff. And I was able to memorize that, and that impressed a lot of people at Ford Motor Company, and I moved up the ladder, got a job with Ford Motor Company, and at a very young age became very successful, had a great job as far as pay was concerned, and I really thought, I've done it. I've become successful. I'm making money hand over fist, more than my dad ever made in his life. I'm proving to him that I don't need him. I can do it on my... There's a way that seems right to a man. I really thought if I could just become successful, if I could achieve, if I could earn and out-earn more than my daddy ever made, then I would feel fulfilled, that life would be complete, that I would feel like I was a victor for the first time in my life instead of a victim, that I would finally be satisfied and fulfilled, and that was the key to enjoying life, was having a whole lot of money and wealth and achievements and all those things. I was driving new cars all the time, worked for Ford Motor Company over a four-state area, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. I mean, you know, staying in motels and flying here and there and doing this and that. And I was absolutely, without a doubt, the most miserable person you'd ever want to meet in your life. It didn't bring me any joy. There wasn't any happiness. I was still as angry and empty as I'd ever been in my life. And I remember one night in Lincoln, Nebraska, sitting in a motel room across from the state penitentiary of that state. And I remember sitting there thinking, I'm not any better off than them guys across the street in the prison. There's got to be more to life than this. Education didn't do it. Career didn't do it. Money didn't do it. What's missing in my life? And I remember thinking, well, you know, probably the reason I feel the way I do is because of being from a dysfunctional family, and my dad run off, and then, you know, all the things going on. And maybe what's missing in my life, if I'd find a good woman and get married and begin a family, maybe that's what's missing in my life. And it wasn't like I was on a panic search to find a bride, but up until that time in my life, I'd been so busy studying and going to school and working and all that, I didn't have time for dating and all of those things. But I began to entertain thoughts about maybe that's what's missing in my life. There's a way that seems right to a man. I really thought if I can just meet somebody, that'd be the end of all my problems. And I remember being at the Merry-Go-Round nightclub in Kansas City, Kansas on Southwest Boulevard one night. I went walking through there, and it was one of those nightclubs that had those little Tiffany lamps hanging down over the tables and smoke so thick you couldn't hardly walk through there. And don't look all pious at me. I know some of you folks have been in those places too. But anyway, I went walking through there, and I looked over, and there sat a woman with green hair. Now, this day and time, you wouldn't think much about seeing somebody with green hair, but back in the 70s, I mean, that was, and I looked at her and kind of did a double take, and I just kind of stood there looking at her. And she looked up at me and she said, "You got a problem?" I said, "Is your hair green?" She said, "Yeah, so what?" I just sat down across the table from her and stuck my hand out and said, "My name's Ron, what's yours?" I thought anybody who'd go out into public looking like that had to know how to have a good time. I wanted to get to know her, and so we struck up a conversation. I asked her out on a date. We began to date. She was high on dope most of the time. I was drinking Budweiser like it was going out of style, and that's how we began our relationship. 6 months later, we sobered up just long enough to get married, and I'll guarantee you that is no way to begin a marriage. Through God's grace and infinite mercy, she and I have stuck together for 40 years now, and I'm telling you, we had a rough start, but if it wasn't for Jesus, we'd have never made it. But anyway, when we'd been married just a short time, I remember thinking, you know what? I'm pretty fond of her, but this ain't what was missing in my life. This is not the answer to happiness, I know that. And I thought, so if it's not education and it's not a career and it's not material things, then what's missing in my life? Why do I still feel so empty? And you ever feel like everybody in the world got all the puzzle pieces figured out except you, and you're the only one that hadn't caught on to what's happening yet? That's how I felt all the time. And I remember thinking, well, it's probably that family thing. We don't have any kids. I mean, you know, if we started having some kids, maybe that's what's missing in my life. Y'all are thinking, boy, he did burn his brain out on that booze, didn't he? But anyway, we began thinking, starting a family, and I remember when my wife told me, she said, "I'm pregnant," I thought, man, this is it. This is what's been missing in our life. And we began to fix up a nursery and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and I thought, this is going to be tremendous. This is what's been missing all along. This is the answer. And I remember when, we took her to the hospital for that little baby to be born. How many of you, they didn't used to let dads go in the delivery room, but how many of you daddies got to go into the delivery room and see your kids come into this world? Was that something or what? Man, I'm telling you, I was standing in there, and that doctor said, if you pass out, fall that away. And my wife said, what do you mean fall? I'm laying here on the table. He said, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to him. He looks green. And I mean, it was inexperienced. But anyway, when that little baby come out of there and they spanked her on the bottom and she started crying, they stuck that little thing in my arms. I looked down, and I'm telling you, that was the most red, wrinkled, ugly-looking thing I've ever seen in my life, but it was mine, and I was proud of her, and I thought, this is what's been missing in my life. And life was tremendous and complete, and I felt fulfilled for about 6 weeks. And then colic. How many of you been blessed with that? Colic started in. She's crying and fussy and just, upset stomach, and so the doctor said, well, maybe it's the breast milk that's causing her to be this way, so we're going to put her on an infant formula called Neomol Soy. It was a soybean-based infant formula that was made by the Syntex Corporation in Elgin, Illinois. And we just did what the doctor told us to do, and she continued to get worse. And we took her back to the pediatrician, and they checked her over and said, just keep feeding her. It's just normal for kids to cry when they're little. When I say cry, I don't mean she just was a little fussy. I mean she got to the point by the time she was about 10, 12 weeks old, something like that, she's just crying nonstop, fall asleep for maybe an hour or two, wake up screaming and crying for another 2 or 3 hours, fall asleep for an hour, scream for 2 or 3 hours. That went on for 24 hours around the clock, 7 days a week. By the time she was 6 months old, she was at the point where she was just screaming all the time, projectile vomiting, diarrhea, descended stomach, sunken eyes, twisted legs. And we'd had her to every doctor and pediatrician in Kansas City, and nobody could find out what the problem was. I remember the day that finally a doctor at KU Medical Center was the one who discovered it. He had had a bunch of referrals from pediatricians all over the metro, and he was looking at different records and charts of all these different kids, and one day as he was sitting in his office, he realized the common denominator between all these kids was that they were all on the same infant formula. So he did a little checking and found out that the Syntex Corporation, they thought that some doctors had been asking questions about, well, you know, sodium salt is bad for people when they get older because of heart disease and this and that. So if it's that harmful to an adult, what's it doing to our children that are getting that stuff in infant formula? So this company had the bright idea, well, if they keep pushing that idea, they're going to make us take all the salt out of the formula, so we'll beat them to the punch. We'll just go ahead and take it out, and then we'll be able to advertise salt-free infant formula, and we'll be the first ones on the market to have it, and we can make a lot of money on this deal. They ran no tests, no checks, nothing. At that time, there was more federal regulations on pet food than there was infant formula. And what they didn't realize was that when human beings are deprived from salt at birth, the body doesn't finish its developmental process. That first 6 months of life is when the brain finishes developing, and when it's deprived of nutrition, it doesn't develop as it should, and it causes all kinds of problems. Most of the kids who were on that infant formula, there were a number of them who died. Most of them, 95.8%, suffered from extreme mental retardation. Most of them were blind, deaf, dumb, had no control over their motor skill abilities. Their hands and feet just kind of flop around. And I tell you, it was one of the worst things you've ever seen. Back in those days, 60 Minutes and a news program called 2020 did an expose on it, and when they found out what the problem was, and it made headlines nationwide. As a result of that, the laws were changed, and they now have regulation on infant formula about what goes in and what doesn't. But I tell you, I will never forget the day that I sat across the desk from a doctor, and he looked me straight in the face. Our daughter was about 9 months old at that time. He said, "Mr. and Mrs. Mills, I don't know any other way to tell you than just tell you straight. There's no use to sugarcoat it. I just have to tell you like it is. If your daughter lives, she is as far along mentally as she will ever be. You're never going to roll a ball across the floor and have her roll it back to you. You're never going to see her crawl over to the coffee table and pull up and take those first few wobbly steps. She is never going to go out the door and get on a yellow school bus. Those things will never happen if she lives. You need to face facts and deal with reality." I felt like somebody had reached across that desk and just hit me right in the pit of the stomach with a sledgehammer. There's a way that seems right unto a man. I really thought marriage, family, kids, I thought that was going to be the end of all my problems, and everything would be smooth sailing and sunshine and roses from that point forward. But what I didn't realize was I was on the wrong track with the wrong answers, looking for hope and peace in all the wrong places. I remember when our daughter really began to get sick, I mean, the only thing that would pacify her was just wrap her up in one of those receiving blankets real tight and put her on your shoulder and just pat her. And because of that and needing constant attention, my wife quit her job and stayed home. And about that time, the automobile business kind of took a nosedive, and my job salary kind of went down. So we went from 2 good salaries to 1 meager salary. And insurance wouldn't pay any of the medical claims because they said, "You take legal action against the company that made the infant formula. It's not our fault," and blah, blah, blah. And so we're tied up in court battles and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember getting up to go to work one morning. And the alarm went off, and I reached over and shut that thing off. You know how you are when you first wake up in the morning, just kind of in that fog of not completely awake and not asleep. And I was sitting there on the edge of the bed just kind of trying to thaw out a little bit. And I was more miserable than I had ever been in my life. I remember sitting there on the edge of that bed, and I prayed probably for the very first time in my life. I didn't know that's what you called it. I didn't know prayer was talking to God, but I sat there on the edge of that bed, and I remember saying something like, God, if there even is such a thing or such a person, I need help. Everything I counted on in life that I thought was going to bring me happiness and fulfillment is just like sand running through my fingers. I don't own anything on this earth that's not in mortgage to the bank. My wife's ready to walk out the door because of all the things going on with our daughter. Our daughter's dying. I don't get along with my folks or family. And I can't fix any of it. If there's any way you can help me, I need help. I got up and went to work, and for the next couple of weeks it was just business as usual. And then I remember one Saturday night my daughter had really gotten really sick and just fussing and wouldn't calm quiet down at all. And I had her in that blanket and had her on my shoulder and patting her, and I don't know how it is that kids know. I mean, as long as you know you got her on your shoulder and you're patting her, she was kind of calm. But the minute you sit down in a chair, the eyes pop open and the screaming starts back in. And so I walked with her on my shoulder from about 6 or 7 o'clock on Saturday night till about, I don't know, I think it was like 6 or 7 o'clock on Sunday morning. Finally got her to go to sleep. Took her in and laid her in her bed, and I went in and laid down, and she slept for about an hour and woke up screaming again. My wife woke up and said, "You were up with her all night, I'll go take care of her." And as my wife was walking out of the bedroom, we had a little 13-inch television sitting there in the bedroom by the door. She walked past that TV, she reached down and clicked that TV on, and I said, "Don't turn that thing on, I'm tired, I want to get some sleep." She said, "Well, you're not going to get any sleep with that crying going on. Maybe the TV will drown the noise down at least enough you can get some rest." I said, "Shut it off." And she just left it on and closed the door and went and got her daughter and took her in the other end of the house. Well, back in those days, 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, guess what came on TV? A preacher. And I thought, them howling fanatics. See, I completely forgot about that prayer 2 weeks ago. God, if there's any way you can help me, I need help. And this preacher comes on, hallelujah, bless the Lord. He's just going crazy on there. And I thought, them fanatics, I've been to church. I know what that's all about. I don't need any of that stuff. And I was too tired or too lazy to get up and change the channel. And thank God I didn't have one of those remote control clickers. And so I just laid there. And something caught my attention. I don't know what that guy was preaching. I don't know whether he was reading out a Reader's Digest or a Bible. I don't have any idea what it was about. But all of a sudden, the thought occurred to me. You ever get a thought smarter than yourself? You know that's from God, amen? And the thought occurred to me, either that guy on TV is the biggest liar and phony and hypocrite that's ever walked on 2 feet, and this book is a complete fabrication of lies and the biggest practical joke that's ever been played on the human race. Or it's real. And I thought, I'm not taking that guy on TV's word from it, because I've been to church. I've been around Christians. I ain't trusting them. But I want to know what's in that book. And I thought, the only way to find out is go get one and read it. You ever try to buy a Bible on a Sunday morning? They're kind of tough to find on Sunday. Those bookstores are closed on Sunday. I thought, maybe I'll go check into a motel and get one of them Gideon Bibles. They're in all the motels I've been staying in. But anyway, I waited till Monday and went to the Bible bookstore. I looked that up in the Yellow Pages. That was before the internet back in those days. And so I go to this Bible bookstore. You ever try to buy a Bible? I mean, I'm glad for all the different translations that we have these days, you know, but I walked into that bookstore and I said, this lady behind the counter said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I want to buy a Bible." And she said, "Yeah, we've got a good selection. What kind do you want?" Now, when she said that, you need to understand, back in those days, and I think it's still around today, there was a book called a Shooter's Bible. Any of you guys familiar with that? It tells you all the different things about guns and bullets and how many grains of powder goes into which caliber shell and all that. I mean, anything you ever want to know about ammunition, it's in the Shooter's Bible. And then there was some hippie wrote a book called how to, the Volkswagen Bible, how to repair anything on a Volkswagen automobile, and different books that were titled Bibles about different subjects. So when she said, "What kind of Bible do you want?" I looked back at her and said, "I want the one that tells about God." And she kind of snickered and said, "Yeah, I understand that, but do you want an NIV, a KJV, an NKJV, an RSV, an AVS, or, I said, "Lady, I don't even know what you're talking about." And she said, "Well, they're different translations." She said, what translation do you want?" I'm thinking, translation? I said, "English. Where do you think we are? France? I mean, give me something I can read." And she said, No. I mean, and she's trying to explain this to me. I said, "Lady, just give me a Bible that tells about God." And she said, "Well, do you want one that's got concordance and reference and maps?" I said, "I don't want to figure out how to get from here to home. I don't need maps. I want a Bible." See, this is before Jesus in my life, and I've got my daddy's temper, and I'm getting frustrated with her, and she's getting frustrated with me. And finally, I said, "Look, lady, either sell me a Bible or I'll go somewhere else and get one." She said, "I'm sorry, but my manager says I have to ask these questions." And I said, "Well, what else do you need to know? All I want's a Bible that tells about God." And she said, "Do you want thumb index and ribbons?" I said, "You sell me some Bible with ribbons in it, them sissy ribbons, I don't want no part of that thing. Just give me a Bible that tells about God." And I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was just the closest one, but I really think she just kind of reached around in frustration and grabbed the first thing she could grab and flopped it up on the counter. It was a Thompson Chain Reference Bible with leather cover, thumb index, ribbons, notes, maps. I mean, it had it all. And she said, "There you go." I said, "How much does that thing cost?" She said, "That'd be $150. I looked at her, I looked at that, I said, "You got to be kidding me." She said, "That's real leather and India paper." I still haven't figured out what India paper is, but they charge more for it. Red letter edition. I thought, red letters, what's that all about? I'm telling you, I didn't know anything about it. And I said, "Really? That thing's $150? She said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, then it's no surprise to me why more folks don't read those things if they cost that much. My goodness." But I was miserable enough. I wanted to know, so I bought the thing, took it home, and I hid it under a stack of towels in the back bathroom so my wife wouldn't see it, because I still had that opinion, that church stuff, that's for women and sissies. Real men don't cry, they don't show emotion, they don't shed tears, they sure don't read Bibles and go to church. And so I didn't want her to know I was reading it, so I hide back in the BC and read the Bible. I really did have a point reading that to you tonight. You ever read the Bible? Man, I started in just like any other book. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God. And I thought, okay, we got the right book. It's talking about God, so I made it through Genesis. Y'all ever read that? Exodus. How did them Jews get in so much trouble with them Egyptians, and they're fighting battles and wars? Ezekiel. Any of y'all ever read that and try to figure out what that's about? There's stuff in there I still don't understand, haven't figured out yet. And I'm thinking, what has all this ancient history got to do with me in the 20th century? But I was miserable enough that I persisted. It took me about 2 months, but I finally got back into the New Testament. I will never forget it as long as I live. It was a sunny spring morning, one March Saturday morning. I'm sitting back there in the BC reading. And I'd made it to Romans chapter 5. And I read verse 8. It says something like this. For God commended His love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And I remember stopping and thinking, now what does that really mean? and I read it again. For God commended His love towards us. I said, commend. Okay, that means to show or to demonstrate, to put on display. God displayed and demonstrated His love in that while we were yet sinners. I said, okay, that means that He's not waiting for me to get good enough. This is addressed to people who are as messed up as I am. That Jesus died for us. And I remember sitting there thinking, God, if I understand what this is talking about, this means that over 2,000 years ago when Jesus died on that cross, He knew that Ron Mills would be born. He knew everything that was going to happen to me. He knew all the mistakes I'd make, the sins I commit. He knew everything about me. And while I was yet a sinner, in order to prove to me that you loved me, you allowed your Son to come and die on the cross. That's what that was talking about back there in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I sat there, I read that verse again and again, and I noticed there were drops of water hitting the page of that Bible, and I realized it was my tears. I hadn't cried since my daddy left home. I thought, am I having a heart attack? Or what's going on? I had the strangest sensation that I knew what that was saying was true. I couldn't understand it. I wasn't able to explain it, but somehow in my knower, are you with me? I knew that Jesus Christ loved me enough to say, Ron, I know there's never going to be a day in your life you're going to be able to do anything good enough to get to heaven on your own. So I'm going to take your place and pay your penalty and die your death on the cross for you, so you can be forgiven. I remember the thought went through my mind, God, you mean church isn't a haven for saints? It's a hospital for sinners? All of them hypocrites and people I ran into, they maybe haven't connected the dots yet, and we're all in the same mess? There's a way that seems right to a man. The end thereof are the ways of death. I remember getting on my knees right there by the BC. It's been almost 37 years ago. And it still reduces me to tears every time I think about it. I hope I never get over that. I didn't know anything about a sinner's prayer. I had never heard the term Romans Road to Salvation. I had never read the 4 spiritual laws. I didn't know what a prayer of repentance meant. All I knew was I was a sinner on my way to hell. No doubt in my mind. And this book's telling me that Jesus loved me enough to die for me. And I remember, as clear as it was yesterday, I got on my knees and I said, God, if you can take this mess of a life I've made and do anything with it, it's yours. I give up. I can't do it without you. I didn't know that you loved me enough to let your Son die for me. Jesus, please forgive me. I'm sorry. I don't know how many angels you can stuff in a BC, but boy, it got crowded in there in a hurry. I felt like I had swallowed liquid sunshine. I knew I didn't take a discipleship course or a training class, but I knew in my heart that God had heard my prayer, He had forgiven my sin, and that if I would have died right there on the spot, I'd have gone right straight to heaven, because I had a clear understanding. It didn't have anything to do with me being good or bad, or the things I'd done in the past, or how much good deeds I could do in the future. It didn't have anything to do with any of that stuff. All it had to do with was the fact that Jesus died for me and took my place on that cross, and when I accepted that and asked Him to come into my heart and take control of my life, that was all God was waiting for to hear from me all of those years. And I knew I was saved. Didn't know that's what you called it, but I knew my sins were forgiven. I knew that somehow in my heart, I just knew everything was going to be okay. And then I started crying, because I felt all that anger toward my dad release. I felt all of that emptiness just vanish. I felt all of that bitterness gone. My wife heard all that crying going on in the bathroom. She come back there and she opened that door and said, "Are you okay?" She looked over. I'm down there on my knees right there by the BC, tears and snot going everywhere. There wasn't anything manly or dignified about it, but it felt good. I looked up at her and pointed my finger at her. I said, "We are going to church tomorrow morning." She said, "We are what?" I said, "We're going to start going to church tomorrow." She just mumbled something about, "Man, you really have fried your brain," and just closed the door and walked out there and left me alone. But I'm telling you, I got up the next day. I start getting ready to go to church, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I told you yesterday we're going to church today." She said, "We can't go to church. The baby's sick." I said, "Fine. You stay home with her. I'm going to church." So I go out and get in the car, and I drive down the street to the first church I can find, and I thought, I'm giving them the acid test right off the bat. I marched in there, walked right down to the second pew, and sat down and just waited for somebody to come tap me on the shoulder and say, "You can't sit there." You know what happened? Somebody come walking down there, stuck their hand out and said, "Hi, my name's Bill. What's your name?" "Man, I'm so glad you're here. I don't remember seeing you here before, but is this the first time you've been with us?" "Yeah." "Well, I'm so glad you're here today. This is going to be a great day in the Lord, and we just want to extend our welcome to you, and we're glad you're here." And I thought, I believe this is the right church. And so they had a little bit of singing and going on, pretty good music, and all of a sudden this guy comes shooting out there on that platform, and man, he slapped that pulpit, started screaming at the top of his lungs something about rock and roll and drugs and alcohol, and I could tell he wasn't for none of them things. And when church was over, he was so hoarse he couldn't hardly talk, and he's standing at the back door shaking hands. And so, everybody, they come up and shake my hand and welcome me and all that stuff. And so when I get ready to go out the back door, preacher shakes my hand and said, "Man, I'm glad you're here today." And I said, "Could I ask you a question?" And he said, "Well, sure, what?" Now, I didn't think about how this would have sounded to him. But I looked at him and I said, "I had something happen to me in my bathroom yesterday that I haven't quite put together yet." He looked at me and I said, "I don't understand what happened, but all I can tell you is I don't remember going more than 5 minutes at a time without a Marlboro or a Budweiser since I can't remember when. And since I was reading the Bible and that experience I had yesterday, I haven't even wanted that stuff." And he looked at me and he went, "Shh, come here." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Come over here." He pulled me off the side and he said, "Don't be telling people that stuff." I said, "What stuff?" I mean, my language was horrible back in those days. I thought, did I slip and say something? I said, "Tell them what stuff?" He said, "All that charismatic deliverance stuff, that Pentecostal stuff." He said, he said, "God doesn't do miracles anymore." I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "All that deliverance and setting you free and all that stuff." He said, "You just had some kind of emotional breakdown. You probably ought to go see a counselor or something, but just calm down and get over it. You'll be okay." I looked at him and I said, "I am in the wrong church again." He said, "What?" And I said, "Never mind." I just walked off. I'm still trying to figure out what happened to me in that bathroom. One morning before I went to work, I went to a Shoney's restaurant there in Blue Springs where I live. And they're the ones that got that buffet in there, you know, and so I go in and they take me in and put me down at a table there. And this other fellow at the table sitting right across from the table I was at, he had just got his plate of food and come over and sat back down. And he sat down there and put his hands in his lap and bowed his head and started praying for his food. That is the first time I ever remember seeing anybody pray out in public. I know God put that guy right there for my benefit. So I wait till he gets done, and I looked at him and I said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "Were you praying just then?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "To God?" And he said, "Well, who else would you pray to?" And I said, "I got some friends that pray to Satan. I wanted to make sure who you're talking to." And he said, "Yeah." He said, I just, you know, I love the Lord, and I wouldn't dare think about taking a bite of food without telling him thanks for it. I believe he's the source of everything I have." I said, "So you pretty serious about this God thing, huh?" And he said, "Yeah, pretty serious." And I said, "Well, could I ask you a question?" He said, "Sure." I said, "A few weeks ago, I was at home in my bathroom, and I had an experience that I haven't figured out quite yet." And he's looking at me kind of funny, and so I tell him, and he said, "You know what? That's the greatest experience in the world, isn't it? To know that your sins are forgiven and that you've become a part of the family of God, and when you die, you're going to go to heaven. Isn't it great?" And I said, "That's it, isn't it? That's what happened. I became a part of God's family. That's the family that had been missing in my life all those years." And he said, "Yeah, it's tremendous." And I said, "Well, how about that?" And he says, "Have you found a church home yet?" And I said, "No, but I sure been looking." And he said, "Well, where have you tried?" And I said, "It didn't work out too good." And he said, "Well, tell you what, I go over here to the Baptist church," and he says, "Matter of fact, we're having revival services this week, and you'd be glad to come if you'd like to tonight at 7 o'clock. And I said, "Revival service? No, I don't want no part of that." See, when he said revival, I'm thinking circus tents, kissing snakes, drinking poison, busting up crutches. You all have those images still in your mind from the old day revivals. And I thought, And he said, no, it's nothing like that. He said, "We have a fellow who's what they call an evangelist." I said, "A what?" He said, "Well, he's a preacher, but he just gets up and reads, you know, several verses out of the Bible and then explains what they mean and how they apply to our lives and how to put it into practice today." I said, "Wait a minute. You got a guy that's actually teaching people what the Bible means?" And he said, "Well, yeah, don't all churches?" I said, "Trust me, buddy, there's a bunch of them ain't got anything close to that." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what. You come tonight at 7 o'clock, you be my guest, and you just check it out for yourself." I went to that revival service every night that week. Every night after church, I'd get up to that evangelist. I put him through more questions, I'll guarantee you, than they asked him in his ordination service. I mean, I asked him about heaven, hell, death, the devil, this, that. I mean, I just about wore him out. But it was wonderful. I mean, it was like pouring water on dry ground. I just couldn't get enough of it. I'd sit up all night long and read Bible. I mean, I literally wore Bibles out when I got saved, just trying to memorize them and figure them out and understand it. God has been so gracious and so good. I think it was about 2 months after I got saved. I'm listening to preachers on the radio. Every time one's on TV, I'm listening to him. I'm getting Robert Schuller one day, and, you know, Benny Hinn, those kind of guys, Oral Roberts back in those days, and this preacher and that preacher and all kinds of stuff. And one of them's telling me there's no need for miracles today because we got the Bible and that's all we need. And somebody else is saying name it and claim it and blab it and grab it. And I'm hearing all kinds of stuff. And I'm really confused. But about 2 months after I got saved, our daughter really started getting bad. Looked like the end was pretty close. I remember sitting there in a chair in our living room one night and praying and reading the Bible. And it's probably about 2:30 in the morning, and I remember I just folded my Bible shut and I said, "God, I'm so confused. I don't understand." One person says we don't have miracles anymore, and somebody else says the only reason you don't get them is if you don't have enough faith. And there's got to be some common ground in there somewhere. And I don't know who to believe, who's right and who's wrong. All I know is there's a little girl laying in there in that bed who's dying. and the doctors can't do anything about it. And Lord, she needs your help. I didn't hear any thunderclaps. There was no lightning bolts. God never said anything. It just was the darkest night I've ever been through. About a week after that, I remember we put our daughter to bed one night about 6 o'clock. She laid down and went to sleep. And we learned real quick in the game, when she sleeps, you sleep, because that may be your only chance. And so I remember we put her to bed and went in, and we laid down, fell asleep. Next thing I know, the sun's coming through the window and woke me up in the morning. And I thought, man, that felt good. That's the first time I slept all night long in over a year. And then I realized I didn't hear any crying. So I reached over and I shook my wife and I said, honey, did you get up with the baby last night? She looked over at me and said, no, didn't you? And I could just watch panic grab her as she jumped to the same conclusion I did. I said, I'll go check on her. You just stay here. I walked down the hallway to her bedroom, and the door wasn't latched, but it was just pulled shut. And just before I pushed that door open, I remember standing there thinking, God, why does it hurt so bad to think that she's died? Why is this so hard? I mean, she's known nothing but pain and hurt all of the time she's been on this planet. She'd probably be better off dead. So why does it bother me so much? It was one of the most significant times in my spiritual walk with the Lord. It was as though He whispered in my heart and said, son, it's because you love her and you want her to know that you're her daddy and that you care about her and that you love her a great deal. I thought, yeah, I guess that's right. I don't want her to die without knowing that. And He said, son, up until a couple of weeks ago, that's exactly where you and I were. I was your Heavenly Father who loved you more than you can imagine. And it wasn't until you stopped long enough to read my word that you understood that. And if you'd have died before you met me in that bathroom that day, you would have died never knowing that I cared about you enough to die for you. I remember standing there thinking, God, you mean this is all my fault? It took something this severe and drastic to stop me long enough to be able to reason and read your word and find out who you are? I never heard a thing. I reached down and pushed the door open, and I looked in our daughter's bedroom, and there in the baby crib sat my daughter, sitting straight up, eyes focused, looking straight ahead, arms and legs straight, stomach flat. She was reaching up and swatting at one of those little mobile things they hang over a baby crib. And when I saw that, I gasped. And she looked over at me and just kind of laughed and went back to playing with it. My daughter literally went to bed sick one night and woke up the next morning healed, healthy, and completely well, and has never suffered any side effects from that day till this. She's 36 years old. She turned me into a grandpa a few years ago, and I told you last night, the doctors call her a medical anomaly. They put her through a CAT scan or an MRI, and they'll tell you she doesn't have enough gray matter in her head to sustain life, and yet she's completely, totally normal. I'm telling you, if God would have told me to go out and walk on water after seeing that, brother, I'd either drowned or got the job done, one of the two. God just was so real and so rich and so fresh to me that my life changed. I mean, I just couldn't imagine all the miraculous things He had in store for me. And then not long after that, God called me to preach, and I told my wife, and she said, are you sure you just didn't eavesdrop on him talking to somebody else? You, a preacher? I said, honey, I promised him in the BC that whatever he wanted in my life, it was his. And if that's what he wants, and I've been doing this now for 32 years. God has opened doors for me to go and share my story on TV, radio. It's been written up in magazines and books. We have seen literally thousands and thousands of people come to faith in Jesus Christ just because I've been able to share my story with so many folks. He's allowed me to write and publish and author books. He's allowed me to preach in, I think, 22 or 23 different states, 14 different foreign countries. God has put me in places that I never dreamed possible. And my encouragement to you tonight is this: if God can take a drunken automobile mechanic from a dysfunctional home and change his life through something as simple as watching a television program on TV, just imagine what he could do with your life. I didn't have anybody in that bathroom helping me that day trying to figure things out and understand things. I sure wished I would have. But could I help you tonight? I really believe there's somebody here tonight that you think you got it all figured out. You think you've got all the answers. There's a way that seems right, but the end thereof are the ways of death. The Bible clearly tells us it is so simple that most people stumble over it. If you will confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. It's that simple. Doesn't say anything about joining a church or putting money in an offering plate or doing some religious thing. It just simply says if you'll confess to God that you want Jesus to be in total control of your life and you're willing to turn it over to him and surrender to him, and you believe that he died on that cross for your sin and rose again from the dead, that is all there is to it. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. My friend, you can join every church in this county. You can get baptized in every creek, river, and pond. You can drink grape juice and eat crackers. You can go to confession booths and all that kind of stuff and still split hell wide open when you die. If you don't confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you may think what you've got's real. It may seem right and reasonable and rational, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Would you pray with me tonight? I know I've been long-winded and you've been very patient, but just hang on for a minute if you can. Father, I want to thank you for this opportunity to once again tell people of your amazing grace, your goodness in my life. I thank you, God, that you saved me and forgave me, and you've created something in my life that I never dreamed possible. And Lord, there's nobody more keenly aware than me that it's nothing to do with me. It's all of you. And Lord, I want to pray for those who are here tonight who have never trusted Jesus as their Savior. I'm so glad they came tonight. I'm so thankful somebody cared enough about them to invite them. I'm so glad, God, that they're here. Lord, would you open their heart? Would you just whisper to them and convict them not only of the sins that they've committed, but that you would also convince them of your great, great love for them and how much you care about them.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. If you have prayer requests, need to contact us, or need directions to the church, check us out online at FBCKeiser.com. If you want to join us, we're located at 210 East Main Street, or give us a call at 870-526-2604, or send mail to P.O. Box 306, Keiser, Arkansas 72351. We'd love to see you soon. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you.
Speaking to my soul.